Carl Jung always said that the scariest journey we can take is the one that leads us inside ourselves. But what happens when this journey is not chosen but forced? When something external, an experience, a shock, a loss, forces us to confront the darkest aspects of our minds. Few dare to look into these little-known territories. We live surrounded by distractions that keep us from our deepest pain. But what if I told you that the deepest secrets of the human mind are not contained in scientific treatises, but in the voices of those who have been silenced? What Carl Jung discovered did not come from books, but from what he heard from people who society tried to silence. Men and women considered crazy, but who cling to truths that most of us ignore all our lives. Today I'm going to take you into this world. This is not just a video, it is a dangerous journey. A journey to the limits of sanity, where the line between real and illusory dissolves. And if you stay until the end, I promise you will leave this video with a new vision of your own mind, your own fears and your own reality. But be warned, once you hear these words, you will never see yourself or the world the same again. When I first entered the psychiatric clinic, I did not know that I was about to go through a portal into a universe that most people prefer to ignore. I was there not simply as a doctor, but also as a student of the human soul. The gates were high and rusty, as if they had withstood the test of time and held secrets that few dared to approach. The atmosphere was dense, filled with something invisible but deeply present. It was not fear, and it was not simply curiosity. It was something deeper, as if it were the physical manifestation of Jung's collective unconscious, a reflection of the shadows that we all carry within ourselves, but which we deny throughout our lives. The corridors were cold, long, and seemed endless. Each of my steps echoed on the floor but mixed with other sounds, some distant, others closer, uncontrolled laughter. Not joy, but something else. Something that seemed the laughter of the universe itself, then a sharp cry full of despair, and suddenly silence. But not an ordinary silence. It was a deep, suffocating silence, as if the air itself had frozen in time. And then a thought came to my mind. Are all those here really crazy? Or are they the only ones who truly see the truth? The shadows of the human mind are a mystery that has always interested Jung. He believed that within each of us there are hidden aspects, parts that we suppress and which, if ignored, can become destructive forces. But what if those whom we call crazy were not simply sick, but people who simply could not hide their shadows? This was a question I could not get out of my head, and it was then that I met Abel. His real name does not matter, because he could be anyone. Abel was a man with a penetrating gaze that made you feel as if you were being read from the inside. His face bore the marks of a man carrying a burden far greater than others could imagine. Abel was not an ordinary patient. Until recently, he was one of the most respected psychiatrists in the city, and now he was there, classified as crazy, in seclusion with those whom he had once tried to understand. That night, I could not sleep. Why? Because one thought dominated me. If a psychiatrist, a student of the human mind, can be considered crazy, what prevents us from crossing that same line? How many strange thoughts have crossed your mind, but you have not told anyone about them? How many times have you questioned the surrounding reality, but quickly discarded the idea, fearing what it might mean? What distinguishes a crazy person from a normal person? Is it simply a matter of time? Or is it a true madness living in a society that makes us ignore parts of ourselves? And, most importantly, could it be that what we call madness is not actually a portal to something that we do not understand? Abel looked at me with a mysterious smile, as if he knew something that I did not. And it was at that moment that I realized the answer to these questions was not in books, but in the words of those who had been silenced, those who had somehow gained access to something that society was too afraid to understand. The line between sanity and madness has always been fragile, but that night I felt that it broke. And it was then that Abel told me something that forever changed my view of the human mind, and that is what I will tell you in the next part. But first, I want you to tell me, have you ever had a thought that made you question reality itself? Have you ever felt that there is something inside you that wants to be heard but you are trying to silence it? If so, perhaps it is time to finally meet that shadow And I promise you will see what happens when we look at what we are trying to avoid in our lives. But be careful, after this there is no turning back. No, this was only the beginning. If you want to continue this journey, do not forget to like this video and leave your comment. I want to know what reality is for you, and if you really want to understand the secrets of the human mind that Carl Jung discovered, then do not miss what comes next. It is closer than you think, and believe me, it may be scarier than any nightmare. That night, lying in bed staring at the ceiling of the cold hospital room, my mind would not leave me alone. The distant laughter from the corridors, the incomprehensible rustling that seemed to come from the walls. But above all, Abel's gaze, a gaze in which there was neither despair nor resignation, but a haunting question, a question that consumed me, and the more I tried to push it away, the deeper it took root in my consciousness. Abel was not simply a patient. Before he ended up there, he was one of the most brilliant psychiatrists in the city. He was respected by his colleagues, and patients, who trusted him to help them unravel their troubled minds, sought him out. But now, ironically, he was on the other side of the table. Now he was the object of study, and unlike the other patients, who struggled between outbursts of anger and deep silence, Abel was always serene. I looked at him, and this troubled me because there was something in him that made me doubt the very nature of sanity. If a man who had dedicated his life to studying the human mind had been labeled crazy, who could say that we are not all simply separate parts of a much larger puzzle? What if the crazy people were simply those who could no longer hide the truth? He looked at me for a moment and smiled, as if he already knew what I was going to ask. I did not want to beat around the bush. I went straight to the point. You were a psychiatrist, now you are a patient. How did this happen? Abel tilted his head slightly to the side, as if observing a child trying to understand something far beyond his perception. The right question, doctor, is not how this happened, but how you have not noticed it yet. I frowned, perplexed. He sighed, placing his hands on his knees. Sanity is nothing more than consensus, a carefully constructed lie that allows us all to live our lives pretending that we know what we are doing. I remained silent, trying to digest his words. He continued, You think madness is a mistake? You believe that people here are broken, that something inside them has failed. Well, I tell you, doctor, that perhaps the real madness is out there. He pointed to the window behind me, where the gray sky stretched over the distant city. People live trapped in routines that destroy them. They feign happiness in lives that have no meaning. They drown in distractions to avoid meeting their shadows. And those who can no longer live that illusion, well, they end up here. He smiled slightly. I simply arrived before you. What even is madness? Abel's words echoed within me, and suddenly I was struck by something as obvious as it was disturbing. How often do those of us considered normal ignore our own warning signs? How much do we try to justify with something temporary? How many outbursts of anger do we suppress until they grow into disease in the body? How much pain do we endure in silence, believing that it will simply disappear? Perhaps the difference between a patient in a psychiatric hospital and an ordinary citizen is simply the ability to continue pretending. This made me stop and think. In what moments have you felt that something inside you was about to fall apart, but you held on tightly and kept going? Have you ever experienced the strange feeling that something is deeply wrong in your life but you cannot express it in words? If so, perhaps you have more in common with Abel than you think, and perhaps the only difference between you and him is that he stopped fighting that feeling. Denial is an illusion. I wanted to know more. I looked into Abel's eyes and asked, Do you believe you are sick? He laughed quietly as if my question was childish. Have you never heard voices? Have you never seen what no one else has seen? He slowly shook his head. The problem, doctor, is that you believe that truth belongs to the majority, but tell me, if everyone around you were blind, would you also believe that light does not exist? I felt a shiver run down my spine, and a more disturbing question arose within me. But what if they are not illusions? What if they are not lying? What if they are denying them because for them they are more real than anything else? What distinguishes hallucinations from unwavering faith? What gives us confidence that what we feel is not simply an echo of our own mind, a reflection? The mirror of madness hung in the air, and I could not forget it. "Doctor, do you really know what is real?" This phrase echoed in my head like an unanswerable riddle. What is real? The routine of the ordinary person who wakes up every day, wears the same social mask, and follows the same path, feeling emptiness inside? Or the vision of a person isolated from the world who sees what no one else sees? Perhaps Abel was right. Perhaps the only difference between those who are inside and outside this clinic is that we still have the illusion of control. But how long can this illusion last? And when it breaks, will we be ready to face what lurks in the shadows? Many of these reflections are not simply theoretical. They are deeply connected to what we experience every day. How we deal with our emotions, the shadows that we prefer to ignore, the signals that our body and mind send us but that we drown out with distractions. And that is why he created the Jung 5 minutes a day method for inner peace and mental clarity. A practical guide for those who want not only to understand these concepts, but also to apply them in everyday life, because it is not enough to reflect. It is necessary to act. The ebook is available in the pinned comment to this video. And if you feel that something inside you has been trying to speak for a long time, perhaps this is your chance to finally listen. I never knew exactly when it started. This strange feeling, as if something was brewing. After my talks with Abel, this feeling was stronger than ever, and the more I tried to push it away, the more it took root in my consciousness. Have you ever felt this? As if some part of you was always trying to speak but was silenced before you could find the words? If so, perhaps you are closer to the truth than you think. The next morning I returned to meet with Abel. He was sitting at the table, interlacing his fingers and staring at some distant point. "You have returned," he said without looking up. I pulled up a chair and sat down. "I still have questions." He smiled. "They all do. Few accept the answers." I crossed my arms, waiting. He took a deep breath. "Have you ever looked at a broken mirror?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" He slowly turned his head towards me. His gaze was filled with a disturbing calmness. "What do you see when you look in the mirror?" I blinked a few times, not understanding where he was going. "I see myself," he shook his head. "No. You only see a reflection. Just a part." I was silent. He continued. "What if the mirror cracks? What do you see now?" I understood. When a mirror breaks, it does not erase the image it reflects. It simply fragments it. What if what we call madness is exactly that? A distorted reflection of what we all carry within ourselves. Abel's words resonated with me in a way I did not expect. Because if they were true, it would mean that the difference between sanity and madness is much more fragile than we think. And then, like lightning, a thought struck me. What if, instead of treating crazy people as patients, we should treat them as messengers? Have we been listening to the wrong voices all this time? The psychiatric hospital was a very special world. I spent hours observing the patients. There was a man who spent all day drawing spirals, a woman who whispered to herself, another patient who always repeated the same phrase, "They are coming, they are coming." At first I thought it was paranoia, but then I asked myself, what if he was somehow right? What if the only difference between a prophet and a madman is that one of them found someone who would listen to him? One night before going to bed, I stared at the dark ceiling of my room. Then I remembered a curious fact. In the Middle Ages, those who saw visions were called saints. Today, they are diagnosed with schizophrenia. What has changed? The human mind, or simply the way we interpret its signals? The next morning I saw Abel again. This time I was the one who asked the question, what if you are right? If reality is just a broken mirror, then the only way to see the whole picture is to look through the cracks. A shiver ran down my spine. He smiled, as if he had been waiting for this moment. And you, doctor, are you ready to look? Perhaps this is the most important question in this video. Are you ready to look? Or are you still hiding behind the illusion that you know who you are? I want you to answer me in the comments. Tell me, At what moment in your life did you realize that reality is not as solid as it seems? And if you have never had such a moment, perhaps it is time to ask yourself what is truly real for you. But be careful, because once you start this journey, there is no turning back. There is a concept that few dare to question. The idea that the body and mind are separate entities, that the pain we feel in our soul is not reflected in the physical, that what we think and feel is just a chemical game, a trick of the brain, that has no real consequences for our physical state. But what if this separation were a lie? What if how we deal with our emotions is directly related to what we feel in our own body? And even more, what if madness were not just a mental disorder but a manifestation of the organism itself? I remember a patient. She spent her days sitting by the window staring at an undefined point on the horizon. He did not speak, he did not respond, until one day while I was taking notes she said something unexpected. The silence is heavy. I looked at her in surprise. What do you mean? She did not take her eyes off the window. Heavy in my chest, on my back, on my legs, as if it were crushing me. The state she was describing was not psychological. It was physical. The silence was not just psychological for her, it had weight, it hurt. And then I asked myself, how much of the pain we endure is actually emotions that were never expressed? The invisible weight of the mind. Modern research confirms what philosophers and healers have known for centuries. Stress can cause heart disease, anxiety can cause ulcers, trauma can accumulate in muscles, leading to chronic pain. And here is what few know. In a study published in the journal Psychosomatic Medicine, it was found that patients who experienced emotional abuse in childhood are twice as likely to develop autoimmune diseases in adulthood. What does this mean? What we ignore does not disappear, it transforms. If we cannot deal with it in the mind, our body takes it upon itself, and maybe, if the mind is damaged enough, madness becomes inevitable. What does this have to do with Abel? Everything. He was not just a man with strange ideas about reality. He was a man whose body and mind had broken down, and this breakdown manifested in ways that modern psychiatry still cannot understand. I asked the question that had been haunting me for several days. Abel, do you feel pain? He laughed, shaking his head. Do you want to know if my body hurts? I nodded. He crossed his arms, lost in thought. Pain. A strange concept, doctor. I do not know if I feel pain, or if I am pain itself. His words disturbed me, but thinking about it, how many times have you felt something similar? Not physical pain, but a crushing sensation, a nameless longing, a fatigue that cannot be cured with rest, a fatigue that comes from the soul? If you have gone through this, then perhaps you understand what Abel was trying to say. The modern disconnect. We live in an age of distractions. If we are sad, we turn on the television. If we feel frustrated, we pick up our mobile phone. If we are afraid, we anesthetize ourselves with purchases, food, everything that keeps us from the emptiness. But what happens when these distractions are no longer enough? What happens when the body decides that it is time to feel? Studies show that people who have experienced periods of intense emotional stress often report unexplained physical symptoms, muscle pain without a visible cause, heart palpitations not detected during heart exams, dizziness, extreme fatigue, a feeling of heaviness in the chest, and modern psychiatry, however advanced it may be, has not yet found answers to all these connections. But Jung was already talking about this decades ago. He believed that when we suppress our emotions, when we avoid traumas, they find a way to express themselves. If not through the mind, through the body. And if we continue to ignore these signs, perhaps one day the collapse will become inevitable, the thin line between sanity and chaos. At the end of the day, before leaving the hospital, I took one last look at Abel. His gaze was still lost, but his face looked alive. He was calm. I was not, because that day I realized something disturbing. Perhaps those whom we call crazy are simply those who can no longer pretend. Perhaps there is no clear line between sanity and madness. Perhaps we are all on a spectrum, and the only difference is how long we can keep pretending that everything is okay. What keeps us on our feet? What keeps us from crossing that invisible line? Perhaps the answer was closer than I thought. Perhaps Abel had the key, and in our last conversation he revealed it to me. So what separates sanity and madness? A line thinner than we would like to admit. I have spent my life trying to understand what distinguishes a sane person from someone who has lost touch with reality. But after all my talks with Abel, after hearing his words and feeling his presence, I have realized that perhaps this separation is just an illusion. What if madness is not a failure of the mind but a natural response to something that we simply cannot bear? What if the real madness is the silence of those who refuse to listen? In my last conversation with Abel, I asked the question that I had not dared to ask before. What happened to you? He sighed, looking at his hands. Do you want to know what brought me here? He was absent for a long time, silent. And then, with a disturbing look, he looked at me. And at that moment I felt that I was facing something that could not be repaired. The life I had lived, the person I was sure I was, the certainties I had built, everything fell apart. He smiled, so that was not happy or sad. And when that happens, doctor, there is no turning back. I felt a chill. So you went crazy? He shrugged his shoulders. Or did I wake up? The collapse of identity. There was a time when I thought madness was a deficiency, that something inside the brain had failed and caused the person to lose himself. But now, after everything I have seen, I am starting to wonder, what if madness is a defense mechanism? What if it is the only way out when the mind faces a truth that it cannot bear? What if it is the inevitable collapse of an identity built on illusions? Because think about it. How many times in your life have you felt that your existence has no meaning? That everything you have built, your routines, your certainties, were nothing more than a fragile attempt to bring order to chaos? What if for a second that order completely disappears? What would remain? What helps us stay sane? This is what I constantly ask myself looking at Abel. Because if everything he said was true, then what keeps us from crossing that line? What holds us to the idea that we still have control? And the answer came from where I least expected. From myself. Because by trying to understand Abel, I realized that I was trying to understand myself. Somehow he was not just a patient in a psychiatric hospital. He was a mirror. And it was at that moment that I realized something that changed. Everything. Maybe we are all Abel, the truth that we do not want to see. Jung said that what we do not face in ourselves eventually becomes our destiny. And now, sitting in front of Abel, I understood what that meant. We all carry truths within us that we avoid confronting. We each have parts of our minds that we keep locked away. And maybe the difference between a person who continues to live a normal life and a person who gets lost in madness is simply the weight of what each one is trying to hide. Because the truth is, sanity is not a state. It is a fragile balance, and when that balance is broken, there is nowhere to run. The only thing left is to face what we have always tried to avoid. And that night, I left the hospital with the feeling that the world still looked the same. The city lights shone as always. People rushed past, trapped in their routines, but something was different. Because now I knew that behind every forced smile, every lost gaze, every prolonged silence, someone was trying hard not to fall apart, and that the real madness is not in those who gave in, but in those who still pretend that everything is under control. And now I have to ask you, what are you feeling after everything you have heard? What has this story awakened inside you? If something resonates, if a phrase or a thought is stuck in your head, I want you to share it in the comments because this conversation does not end here. In fact, it starts now. Now let's take another step forward. Let's turn all this into something practical, because understanding is only the first step. The real changes happen when we find a way to apply this knowledge in our lives, and that is what we are going to do together at this moment. You may feel another heaviness in your chest. Perhaps you have realized something about yourself that was previously in the shadows. Perhaps a doubt has crept into your head. What am I going to do with all this? Because reflecting on the nature of sanity, madness, the unconscious, and identity is an important step. But if all this remains only at the level of ideas, what is the point? If after this video, You simply return to your routine, as if nothing had changed. All this will be just another distraction, and this cannot be just another distraction. Because perhaps this is your chance to finally look inside and do something with what you find there. Carl Jung said that the greatest danger in life is not external storms, but what we cannot recognize within ourselves. Most people avoid this meeting, and whoever runs away from himself will sooner or later be haunted by what he left behind. But you have come this far, which means that you are probably ready to take one more step. It is not enough to understand. It is necessary to turn that understanding into something that changes your life. And that is why now I want to present you with a plan. Not an abstract plan full of beautiful phrases that sound good but lead nowhere, but a real plan, something that you can apply now, something that if taken seriously can change your way of thinking, feeling, and existing in the world. Let's call it the integration path. This path has 3 stages. It is not something that you have to do all at once. Everyone has their own time. But if you follow these steps, you will be sure that everything you learn here does not just stay in the intellect, but becomes a real transformation in your life. Phase 1. Meeting the shadow. The first stage is easy to understand but difficult to execute, and that is why almost no one does it. You need to face yourself, no filters, no masks, without the need to appear strong, intelligent, or balanced. For a moment, forget about having to be someone whom others approve of. Ask yourself, what parts of myself do I avoid the most? What thoughts or feelings scare me? What truth about myself am I not even telling myself? Take a notebook and write. Let it all out. Do not worry about logic. Write as if you are opening a door that has been closed for many years. If you are uncomfortable, you are on the right path. If it is difficult, it is because you are breaking a barrier. And if you are scared, remember that the monster is not always what scares us. Sometimes it is just a part of us that has been alone in the dark for too long. Stage 2. Reconciliation. Seeing your shadow is the first step, but it is the second step that truly frees you. What is the point of knowing your shadow without learning to live with it? That is like finding a locked door and not having the courage to open it. Reconciliation begins with the question, what is this part of me trying to teach me? If there is fear, pain, trauma, they are there for a reason, and the only way to transform them is not to fight them, but to understand their purpose. Have you ever wondered why some people repeat the same mistakes? Why some pains return even after so much time? Why certain patterns repeat in relationships, choices, disappointments? Often this happens because we are ignoring something that needs to be heard. Perhaps your anxiety is a warning that you are going down the wrong path. Perhaps your sadness is a call to change something that should have changed already. Perhaps your fatigue is a reflection of a burden that you are carrying without even realizing it. If something inside you is telling you something, do not be silent. Listen. Stage 3. Transformation. After seeing, after accepting, now it is time to act. Because nothing will change if you do not change. And here is a secret that few understand. There is no need for great revolutions. You do not have to change your whole life. Small steps are more effective than big intentions that never materialize. Start small. If you notice that you are constantly running away from something, stop and face it. If you notice a negative pattern, change a detail, a thought, a choice. If you feel that something inside you is stuck, look for ways to express it, but do something, because the worst prison is not the one that others impose. It is the one we create for ourselves, and the key to getting out of it has always been in your hands. If you have come this far, it means that you have already taken the first step. But I know that putting all this into practice can seem like a daunting task, so I want to point you to a path, a simple but profound method, something that will help you apply all this in your life day after day, practically and authentically. That is why I recommend that you get to know the Jung 5 minutes a day method for inner peace and mental clarity. This ebook is not just reading material, it is a transformation process. If you feel that you need more clarity, if you feel that there is something inside you that needs to be heard, If you want to learn how to deal with your shadow, your mind, your essence, then this is your next step. The link to the ebook is in the pinned comment to this video, and if I have learned anything in this journey, it is that those who wait for the perfect moment to change never change. Change starts now. The choice is yours. If something in this video has touched you, if a thought, a doubt, a memory has awakened, I want to know. Write in the comments, even if it is something brief, even if it is anonymous, because this channel is not only about reflections, it is about transformation. And if this content has made sense for you, subscribe to Completeness in Reflection, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this, because the world needs more people willing to look inside, and this journey has only just begun.